Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to everyone who is joining us, depending on where you're joining us from today. And thank you for sitting in on the discussion with Association of Canadian University Presses, otherwise known as ACUP, Berghahn Books, Edinburgh University Press, and University of British Columbia. My name is Anne, and I'm your host for this afternoon. And before I introduce our moderator for this afternoon, I would like to cover a few housekeeping rules. Today's meeting is being recorded, and we will be able to share a link with you after the event is complete. We welcome you all to revisit the content later and share it amongst your colleagues. We also invite your comments and questions. Please feel free to input your questions and thoughts into the chat box that you see on the bottom of your screen. And if you have a specific question for the panelists, please type it into the chat box and kindly let us know where you're from, what institution or publisher. And the moderator will bring this question up at the discussion portion of the event. Lastly, you can probably see that we have chosen to host this discussion in a meeting format as opposed to a webinar format. And the rationale here is to enable participation and free conversation between the panelists and the participants. So feel free to chime in whenever. And like Mike said, feel free to have your camera on. But that said, please also be mindful to mute your mics when you're not speaking so that we can all enjoy a seamless conversation between the participants and panelists without any interruptions. And with that said, I'd like to introduce you all to our moderator for this afternoon, Michael Zioli. Michael Zioli is the director of the Publisher Partner Program at De Gruyter, and Mike will moderate our discussion today and will greatly appreciate your robust participation in order to make his job easier. And with that said, Mike, the floor is all yours.
Terrific. Thank you, Anne. Well, thank you all for joining. We have such an impressive group of registrants. I was surprised. This is a first for us. We have librarians from Australia, from Poland, from Amsterdam, Cambridge in the UK, Hungary. It's an impressive spread, as well as, of course, from the US. And I'm surprised at the number of Canadians attending, since we did something like this just a few weeks ago specifically for Canada. But thank you all for joining. It is important to us, and I think it should be important to all of you, to participate. If you want to turn on your camera, that's better. But if you don't want to, but please speak up in any case. We want this to be a discussion. We deliberately do not use PowerPoints. So we don't want to talk at so many people. We have so many great perspectives here. I hope you'll feel free to share. And I know at least a few of you out there, so I hope you won't mind if I call on you if I see a point that I think we'd all benefit from hearing your opinion about. So we have 4 speakers today. I'm sorry. So we have 3 publishers represented on the panel. We have Nicola Ramsey, who's the CEO of Edinburgh University Press. We have Vivian Berghahn from Berghahn Books, with offices in Oxford and New York. We like to tell Vivian that she's a UK publisher, but she says, "Am I really?" So she can comment on that for us. We have Brian Scrivener, who's the director of the University of Calgary Press, but he's also president of ACUP, which is the Association of Canadian University Presses, which are 17 presses. So he's going to talk to us not just about Calgary, but what's unique about the Canadian University Presses. And I also see we have some representatives from that group in the audience here besides Brian. I saw Kate Fraser from McGill Queen's, for example. So Kate, I hope you'll speak up, and any of the others who may be here. Hello, Kate. Thank you for turning on your camera. And we have Arielle Lomness from the University of British Columbia Library. She's the collection strategy librarian at UBC Kelowna, and very articulate about collection strategies that are used there. And I hope she'll help develop our conversation about collecting the content from and many university presses. We do have many university presses participating also besides those on the panel. So I see Bristol University Press has their camera on. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Simon. I'm Vanessa de Burger from Amsterdam University Press. So we have great voices from the university press community here, besides just our panel, and I know that they'll contribute to our discussion. So the format of this will be to have each of our four panelists speak for 7, 8, 10 minutes, whatever they feel they need to introduce their press and their group of presses adequately. And then we'll open it up to the floor. All right. Well, Vivian has volunteered to go first. So Vivian, tell us about Berghahn, please.
Thank you, Michael. Well, I think we said we'd start with the smallest first. So I'm jumping in and delighted to be here. Thank you for having me. It's really great to see some familiar faces as well as new ones. So yeah, I think just to say just very briefly about the press, because I think I'm very looking much forward to talking about the different models and hearing all the different perspectives we have, because I think we come from many different approaches, but all seem aligned on how to think strategically also about ebooks, especially in these past years, and also what a new normal might look like as we come out of the COVID ebook acceleration and sort of what that might look for us. So I think just to start by way of introduction, as the name gives away perhaps, although someone did once ask me if it was somehow a coincidence. We are a family firm and we were founded in 1994 by my mother, Marion Berghahn. But so this was her second firm. She had previously founded a firm in the early 80s. So she had been in publishing for quite some time. But what that meant is that our second incarnation, Berghahn Books, grew very quickly, as many authors came with her. So I think that's always characterized this very close relationship between author and editor for us as a press, and stays with us today. So our core areas are social anthropology, sort of the two main foundations, because that's Marion's background. She's an anthropologist by training. And then European history was also a second sort of, and remains a big pillar for us. That comes because although we are a family firm, and my father, Marion's husband, is a historian, we're not family firm enough that he's full-time employee, but he has always been a very close advisor and really helped to build up the firm as we sought to establish our name also within the German history fields. A lot of that came from originally doing translations of prominent German scholars, and so finding an English language market for them was a good way for us as an otherwise relatively unknown press to establish our name in these fields. And then that meant that US and UK and European scholars already writing in English then brought their English language works to us. So, but insofar as being a family firm, my eldest brother Sasha and I joined over 20 years ago. He came first. He started. If you have reached this. Oh, thank you. So he joined first and basically built our website, set up our online presence. So he has remained our tech side. And then I joined shortly thereafter with a focus on the journals program. And that then eventually segued very nicely into ebooks and sort of broader strategies across the divisions. So we're small enough that the two journals and books programs are very closely aligned subject-wise. And that means we take, for instance, on the journal side, also a very sort of subject-oriented approach to our list and how and what we publish. So we do have long-time connections to Oxford, but we do also have an US office. I would say Oxford, I suppose we are a UK press. I'm not quite sure. We do have a very strong UK and European presence, and I think probably our style of publishing is very European, but the US office is a large office for us and has been an important way for us to reach the American market. So now we currently publish around 130 new titles a year, about 60 paperbacks, and our journals program is close to 40. And so our backlist of books is about 3,000. So this has been in the last 25 years, trying to sort of manage our expansion and determine how can we remain the kind of close-knit publisher we are, while also addressing the sort of needs of our lists and the expansion that's coming along. So the program we have now includes other subfields: migration, film studies, environmental studies, gender, Archaeology and sociology are sort of newer lists to us, and they are now developed with 5 commissioning editors who have now joined Marion, who was otherwise heading up all of the commissioning up until a few years ago. So, that also means that the list that we have is sort of very organically grown and remains quite focused, because lists sort of grow out of our more core lists. So, for instance, our film studies list grew out of our German studies list, where we had published on DEFA film, other Eastern European film forms and directors coming out of our Eastern European studies list. Our migration studies list came out of our Anthro list, where we also, with Oxford at the Refugee Studies Centre, had developed a very close relationship. And then another example would be memory studies, which has been a sort of ever-growing field that came out of our history list. Again, very much rooted in World War I, also cultural studies. And so again, these sort of areas grew out of our core areas. So I would say because of that, we have a very close working relationship with our authors and editors. So it's quite incestuous. We have book editors who also work with us on journals and vice versa. And so we have long-standing series, and our authors come back to us or otherwise really do recommend us to their colleagues. We publish a whole range of early career researchers to very well-seasoned academics across universities of all sizes. And, we especially love seeing early career researchers publish if not their first book, then their second book. We can maybe even talk about that later. Sometimes not being technically a university press means that it does limit certain authors who might otherwise want to publish with us in certain fields. But, we love to see as their website bios update to see how they kind of make their way in the world if they tell us. We're always trying to nail them down and remind us to update their bios. But I would say it means that we've also managed to really develop sort of quite niche and what would otherwise be characterized maybe as marginalized areas. Of course, anthropology is known for publishing remote regions, although increasingly other urban areas as well. But even in history, we've sort of tackled new areas where I think young scholars have particularly been champions of pushing against the status quo. So I'm thinking about what's now coming up, sort of German atrocities in Namibia. And these are areas where this became a sort of a really big focus. And we started to see this big surge coming up and an interest in studying this really important and otherwise neglected area. Other examples would be national memory and commemoration, which are ever more important. And for us, these had been areas that had been long tackled in Eastern European and sort of post-Soviet GDR studies. So all of this is to say that we are independent and we kind of always are trying to move and keep up with our fields. And sort of always, I think, as a result, we've really been attuned to sort of underserved authors and really sort of finding ways that we can continue to build and help them reach a wider audience or otherwise, be able to publish books that ensure tenure or promotion. And these are areas that are very important in terms of how we establish our reputation, which takes a long time. So I think there are many plus sides to being independent. We have the flexibility to think about how our lists are developing and to really experiment, not only with models, as we can talk about later, but also with fields and support sort of authors who are starting to flesh out sort of angles of certain disciplines. But of course, it has its challenges. We are fully independent, which means we have no institutional support, which many university presses, although not all, is also represented here. So it means that manifests itself in many ways, and that's accompanied us throughout our development and our growth as a press, all the way from the beginning. Obviously, an ongoing theme is always needing to be very fiscally conservative and really always plan ahead and be prepared for rainy days. And ways to balance sort of being innovative and thinking about new ways while also being very mindful of what is a risk that's a little bit too far. But I would say in terms of sort of some of the challenges we think about as being independent, I mean, one of them, especially early on, has been reach. And again, this brings me back to ebooks. In the print world, it's very hard as a small independent press to get and access the types of channels that allow you to get the books out there especially into libraries. And a lot of that is around approval plans and different ways that collections are developed. And a lot of that means that, of course, in terms of establishing our reputation and underlining, for instance, the peer review process and the very high editorial standards we have in place, we often need to hold ourselves, and we are held, and especially to ourselves, to a sort of a higher standard. But I would say, having said that, once we've lived up to that expectation, the library community has been really supportive, and that's been, you know, an ongoing constant for us to really be able to rely on libraries and be able to see the different areas and the ways we might develop our lists by building off the reputation we've otherwise developed in areas like anthropology, for instance. Of course, the downside to being very dependent on a library market is pricing. So at least, especially as an independent publisher, we are one of those very high-priced monograph publishers, unfortunately. We wish we could find another way to make that work. And I think we probably need to do a much better job about communicating as to why and how we come to price our books and the different ways we position our books and the different audiences we're intending to reach. So, for instance, our library books, unfortunately, then, you know, they're not intended for individual consumption. So we were really early proponents of offering e-paperbacks and sort of individually priced books, and then coming out in paperback as quickly as we can. So all of that sort of brings us back to sort of strategy and just thinking, when you're independent and as a result smaller, you can be more agile, and ultimately you have to be. You have to stay ahead and keep thinking ahead of the curve. And I think, as my mother always says, she said, standing still is going backwards, which I think is a great way to think about it. Although she generally says that when she's being really entrepreneurial, and I'm freaking out just a little bit because I'm a little bit more risk averse of the two of us. But we find the right balance in the end, and I think do what's right. But I think it's really for us about staying on top of trends and doing what we can to serve all portions of our list. So, you know, this can be everything from the first book ethnography of an early career researcher to a massive tome of the who's who in a certain field in history. So I think also just always trying to find ways to serve the span and continue also to support some of these more marginal areas through different models and different approaches. And I would say sort of ultimately that brings us to ebooks, which for us has been a huge help in allowing us to offset these balances, you know, these challenges of access and reach and discoverability that we've really had as a smaller print publisher. It's really been transformational for us to allow us to work across a diverse set of channels and think about different models and different ways we can find to actually make sure that we can get what is an otherwise expensive library hardback to a new audience. So, you know, I think for us, it's always been around thinking about these different models, and that then always brings us back to how we've had to build up what we're doing to best serve the library community as well, and sort of, because without them, we wouldn't exist given our independent status. And I think, you know, really that's why we are here talking, you know, a lot about ebooks and the different models that are out there and the different platforms and the different purposes that they serve. And ultimately, I think, you know, really helping us better serve our fields and our what are otherwise can be quite specialized titles, but no less of a big impact. So I think essentially that's us, and I'm looking forward to talking a little bit more about that later on.
Thank you, Vivian. You raised a lot of topics I know we'll want to delve into. For example, memory and commemoration. I know that's been a huge topic here in North America in different contexts involving Native peoples, civil wars, things like that. And whether statues should come up, come down, where should they be, when are they appropriate, inappropriate, what do they mean over time? And also the fact, I think this will be worth exploring in a bit, of being an independent press, but Berghahn, along with a few others, are always considered in the same group with university presses. Why is that? You, Multilingual Matters, Lynn Reiner Publications, those are just a few that are considered in that group. So you would be in any university press platform and grouped with those rather than with commercial presses. and the pricing is exactly the same for those presses for the same reasons. As Patrick Alexander said about a month ago in one of these, you have a lot more at risk with each and every book. But in any case, let's move on to Edinburgh University Press. So Nicola Ramsey will give us the overview there. Thanks, Vivian. And Nicola, you're on.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to speak today and to introduce Edinburgh University Press. So we are a publisher of academic books and journals in the humanities and social sciences. And similar to Berghahn Books, we've chosen to focus on some core subject areas and aiming to build strength in depth within those subjects, with each list aspiring to reputational excellence. So the lists that we are publishing in across our books and our journals are art and visual culture, classics and ancient history, Islamic and Middle Eastern studies, film and TV studies, language and linguistics, law, literary studies, philosophy, politics and Scottish studies. And we'll be publishing 300 new books and 57 journals across those areas in the next year, with literary studies, Islamic and Middle Eastern studies and film and TV studies being the most prolific lists. With the third largest university press in the UK in revenue terms, with a turnover this year of around £4.5 million, which is about $5.5 million. We have a global base of authors, editors and series editors. And again, similar to Berghahn, we have quite a lot of crossover between our book editors and our journal editors. And we have about a quarter of those based in North America, about half in the UK and Europe, and the remaining quarter in rest of world. And that really speaks to our focus on diversifying the range of voices that we publish, which is something we've been trying to do over the last few years. We employ about 50 people at present across the usual publishing functions of editorial, production, sales, marketing. But we've also more recently been creating new roles in areas like a digital coordinator, a systems project manager, a finance and data analyst. And that really speaks, I think, to the slightly changing face of publishing there and the increasing importance on data and information management. We're based in the centre of Edinburgh and we work a hybrid model. So we have staff in the office about 2 days a week. And we also work with a range of experienced UK-based freelance copy editors who work closely with our in-house production team to make sure that every book is produced to the highest standard. And we have a strong focus on author care at every step of the journey. So again, like Berghahn, it means we have a lot of repeat authors, which we think is a good measure of success in this area. The press is going to be 75 years old next year. And in that time, it's evolved from being a department of the University of Edinburgh, publishing a truly eclectic range of books and representing a not insignificant cost to the university. But we're now a wholly owned subsidiary company with the university as our sole shareholder. And in this capacity, we don't receive any funding from our parent institution. So we have to cover all of our costs via our publishing activities. And we're expected to return a small surplus to provide opportunities to invest in and to grow the business, as well as for that rainy day that comes along every so often. And I think this financial context is important because it means that as a university press, we've got to find that right balance between mission on the one hand and business sustainability on the other. And the 5-year plan that we launched last year for the business is structured according to those twin themes, and they have to carry equal weight because we can't deliver our mission if we don't have the business sustainability. And we're all working in a very challenging context in that regard at the moment. You know, inflation has caused havoc with all of our costs. You know, we see the pressure on library budgets. We see the pressures on academics. You know, the challenge of getting peer review, of getting typescripts delivered when academics have so much else to be doing. The move to open access, where we're really sort of trying to find a sustainable way of finding a solution there. So it's against that background that we've been articulating our vision for EUP under the banner of connecting people and ideas. And a part of that is the aim to create a community of authors, editors, advisors, who are all committed to publishing world-class academic research that will have an impact on how we think about global and local issues. And within that, we think it's really important that we're including a diverse range of voices and ideas, including areas that perhaps aren't part of the mainstream yet. And our author base therefore includes both established academics and early career researchers, because we recognise our role in helping develop the profile of the next generation of scholars, and because we think a lot of the interesting ideas and new ways of thinking are being driven by this group of academics. And this is part of the reason why the De Gruyter programme appeals to us, because we see this as a way of supporting our mission. It allows us to publish a range of important books, including in more niche or very new areas, or from less well-known authors, alongside those publications where we feel more certain that they'll cover their costs because they might be adopted for course use or appeal to a wider readership, or they more straightforwardly meet the criteria of approval plans. So if libraries are able to invest in our complete collections, reassured in the knowledge that as university press publications, every book will have been through a rigorous development and peer review process and will be of an excellent academic standard, this helps create the business sustainability that allows us to continue to deliver on our mission. So I see it very much as a virtuous circle, with the role for university presses and libraries as co-curators of knowledge and information, so that we're working together on that connection of people and ideas.
Nicola, thank you very much for that. So many interesting things there. About the complete collection purchase through De Gruyter that supports all of the titles instead of just those that are most of interest and successful. You have some supporters right here I can see in this crowd. And Louis Houle is there from McGill, who's just recently purchased everything you've published. So he's one of your big supporters, and McGill is.
Thank you, Louis.
Perhaps Louis will comment once we get through our other two presentations. It would be interesting to hear why he did that. And by the way, Vivian, your titles too, and ACUP, of course. But great comments there. You know, I will like to ask after we get through these about the impact of COVID on you finding authors. Because one thing we've heard at De Gruyter from our editors is because for a couple of years at least, conferences were suspended. They weren't able to make the contacts and develop as many manuscripts as in previous years. So that was one unexpected consequence. But anyway, let's move on. Brian Scrivener is here, who's the director of the University of Calgary Press, but also the new president of ACUP, the Association of Canadian University Presses, which is a very interesting group. And Brian is very articulate. So we're looking.
Can't promise that.
I'm promising. I've heard it before. Please share that with our audience here.
Okay, thank you, Michael, and thanks everybody for coming. Conscious of time, I'm going to drop a link to our legacy website into the chat. I say legacy website because sometime in June we'll be launching another compendium website, searchable by subject category, which involves all of the titles of all of our presses. And it's a very diverse group. Because there are so many, I will not go into individual specialities. I mean, Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies is a dead giveaway, but most of the others have their strengths, their regional emphases, because many of them are small presses funded by a particular province or region. And but all of us publish for the international market. There are certain books that have more of a Canadian slant to them, which is really, from a point of view of scholarship, quite interesting, because the interpretations tend to be different from what we see among American scholars, and so it gives a different insight into the particular topic areas. We have also among our members 3 French language presses. They focus on the international scholarship of the Francophonie. And so that, again, is a very different type of scholarship, a very different approach than one sees typically in the Anglophone academia. Some of our presses have been around for more than a century, such as University of Toronto Press. Others are half a dozen years old, such as Concordia. Most of us are somewhere in the middle. Most of us are small, but collectively we publish hundreds of new titles each year and have quite the backlist. So one of the advantages that I see of the De Gruyter offering is that it puts all of our titles searchable by category and subject within one collection, which you as library users can really find something from anything of any topic that you want within our collections. Though again, we are Canadian, proudly Canadian, we focus on Canadian issues, but there is a difference in interpretation. For example, in recent years, there's been an increased emphasis on BIPOC issues, Black and Indigenous people of color, whereas in the United States, many of the publishers would emphasize the Black aspect of that. For us, it's the Indigenous aspect. We have a number of presses such as University of British Columbia, Manitoba, Regina, which have very strong Indigenous lists, Indigenous languages, and not to mention the Nunavut College, of course, which has very strong titles in Inuit studies and by Inuit authors. Though we are Canadian and our universities have funded us to support Canadian scholarship, we also seek authors elsewhere. And for example, we have a series recently started with the British Society for the Philosophy of Science. The first author of the first book in that series is from the University of Pittsburgh. So we're not limited to Canadian scholars. In fact, several of us, if you look at the institutional affiliation of our authors, you'll find really a minority tend to come from, especially our own institution, or even Canadian authors. For example, we're publishing a book right now on Indigenous territorial autonomy, which has 36 authors, 2 of whom are from Canada. So I just wanted to dispel a notion that maybe we're just Canadian publishers publishing on Canadian topics. We are definitely more than that. We're proud of our region, proud of our nation, but we really see academia as being an international area in which to publish. Access to that market is difficult in physical books. Access to books across Canada is difficult because we have such a small population spread across such a large territory. And so Canadian presses have been innovators in non-book formats of scholarly publication. Raven Space, which is a combined effort between University of Washington Press and University of BC Press, has innovative forms of digital publication on Indigenous issues. Wilfrid Laurier University Press in Southern Ontario is exploring peer review for scholarly podcasts. But the core of our work is still in books. And that's where we really look forward to maximizing our reach beyond our core territory with the De Gruyter collection. One of the aspects which I think will be particularly useful is that eventually the books will be chunked by chapter or section within a book. We find when we look at our own download statistics that that is how students tend to use resources these days. That is how instructors tend to assign them. So it provides the librarians and the academics within the institutions much more flexibility in use of the materials. So I'm looking at the time. I think that Arielle needs to fit in some comments. Reach out to me if you have any questions. Check out the website. Late in June, look to or look for a redirect from that website to our new website. So I'll leave my comments of that open for lots of questions.
Oh, Michael, we can't hear you if you're talking.
There we go. Thanks, Brian. One of the things that struck me about working with ACUP is the fact that you work as a group to support each other. So the larger presses are giving resources and support to smaller presses that otherwise would not be able to do some of those things. And so in striking this agreement to move ACUP onto the De Gruyter platform, the collection is available to libraries as a whole. So you can't cherry pick, a library can't cherry pick the University of Toronto or McGill Queen's or University of British Columbia titles, but even the smaller presses that in some cases are publishing 2 books a year will benefit from that. So in total, I think there's something approaching 700 books a year, which, you know, as we saw from Edinburgh, they're doing 300 a year by themselves. So it's about the size of 2 major large university presses and priced very reasonably. So it's a way of capturing the whole of Canadians' university press scholarship and all of the presses benefiting, not just those with the most resources. So I think that's fascinating. And yeah, about half of the universities in Canada at this point have purchased the collection, and it started in the United States as well. So we'll get back to that. By the way, I wanted to point out, I see David Larson, who may not remember me, but we met a long time ago, but from University of Manitoba Press, and does some really interesting Indigenous studies books that should be in every North American library, I think. But we can discuss that more in a minute. Let's move on to Arielle with a library perspective on all of this. Arielle, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Michael. So I'm going to try and talk really fast and tie together some themes that I've heard from everyone so far, and how that kind of relates to my experience working as a collections librarian and what I've heard from some colleagues as well. So for those of you on the call that aren't aware, the University of British Columbia has 2 major campuses, one in Vancouver and one in Kelowna. So I am on the smaller of the 2 campuses, but the way that we purchase resources is for the institution. So we collaborate quite closely between the 2 campuses. Our combined FTE student population is over 50,000. And our research and teaching is very diverse. So we're looking at things from all sorts of angles, languages, historical perspectives, community perspectives. We really do run the gamut of things, except for veterinary medicine. It's basically the exception to our coverage. And one of the reasons that we really try and prioritize those university presses is because we find that the values really align. And I know a number of you have heard me say this before. I mean, when we're looking at sort of and I know I can't remember if it was Vivian who mentioned it or Nikki, but the sort of tenure and promotion process for our scholarly works and our faculty, it's important for us to align with that. And I think a number of our faculty turn to university presses as well. So we support that not only from a collecting angle, but from that sort of scholarly landscape angle as well. We also really appreciate the sort of interdisciplinary nature of them. And also, I mean, they can be niche, but we also find that that's a huge asset. So they're often publishing the things that a lot of other publishers won't touch. They're just too specific, too one-off. And those are the things that we really appreciate. Those are the things that our grad students really like to delve into, include in their research papers. So when we're thinking about it from a reference angle, those are the things that our subject librarians are pointing students to. So And I know there was also the mention from Brian around, the chapter inclusion in coursework, and that's absolutely true. That's what the faculty are using. They're usually turning to chapters, creating those sort of bite-sized pieces of information for the students to use. And it's important to have that breakdown and that functionality on whatever platform the UP content is hosted on. Another thing I want to discuss, and Brian kind of touched on it a little bit, but for us, I mean, there's lots of topics that we like to focus on, and the Indigenous peoples and topics are one element of that, but non-English language is also a major priority to us. So we're looking at Asian languages a lot of the time, or French language, and also those niche historical events. So there was mention of diverse voices and amplification of certain topics and historical perspectives, and that's important to us as well. So when we're looking at sort of the dynamic of the faculty compilation that we have at UBC, and I know that this has happened at other universities across Canada and the US as well, is we're seeing a lot more of the BIPOC faculty moving between institutions that are between the countries. And those perspectives are being brought with them. So one example of that is we're seeing a lot of Indigenous faculty making the move up to Canada from a lot of communities in the US and vice versa. And with that comes those different areas and different needs. So we need to diversify what we're collecting from the UPs that might be in the US. And also what I see as US institutions needing to start to collect Canadian content as well as those folks move around. And I mean, I think this expands to lots of other areas too. That's just one example. And the sort of idea that we have a boundary of a border, but that's an artificial land separation, right? So there's things that span both countries, there's things that span countries around the world. So when we're looking at topics around, social service, homelessness, substance use, these are some topics that are really greatly represented in specific ways through UPs. And they're of importance from perspectives around the world, no matter where that research is coming from. Those are topics that are impacting everyone. And just to touch on, I know there has been mention of open access, and that's one thing that we truly value, and having open dialogue and conversation with UPs, I've always found to be a little bit easier, and drilling down into the workflows and what that looks like, and collaborating on moving forward with open access has been a great advantage for my work with UPs. And from the perspective of purchasing, which I think we'll talk about in a few minutes, as folks I'm sure have questions and comments, but when we're thinking about collecting front list versus evidence-based acquisition versus backlist content, I think there's lots of perspectives and diversity in the needs. And as a large institution, we may be able to go for those front lists, and that might be a priority because of the diverse nature of what we have for our research and teaching. But there are smaller colleges and other institutions that the focuses just aren't simply that wide, right? So the diversity of availability in terms of the front list versus other models is certainly an asset for university presses to consider in terms of selling their content in any country. And I think that will don't limit yourself, and I don't think anybody truly does, but definitely don't limit yourself in the future, and keep that diverse array of options open to everybody. So I'll leave it there, and I'm looking forward to hearing other people's perspectives. And I know there's a number of folks that I've worked with on this call, and I'm sure they'll chime in as well.
Is there anybody, Arielle, that we should point out here and put on the spot?
I mean, I always love to hear Rob's perspective on, and Louis too, on evidence-based acquisitions versus front list. So if they want to jump in, I'm sure they will.
Louis, Rob, you've been called.
Oh, getting there.
Here we are.
I was going to let Rob speak first. I mean, I don't know. I mean, we can say a lot of things. I mean, it's interesting, different approach, as Arielle mentioned, and it's not, I guess, one size fits all. That's whether we like it or not, whether I like it or not. It's not the same, and we have a different approach, sort of, at our place, our institution, as opposed, like Arielle mentioned, evidence-based acquisition. we're not doing anything with this at McGill except for streaming videos one place. The reasons, I mean, there are many reasons. And going for, well, first of all, we don't know, of course, we never know what and when a title will be used for what purpose. It could be, as Brian mentioned, was a chapter which is coming more and more, so we see more and more. And when also as well, I mean, did some data. It's interesting to see that. I heard that before also as well with the Gruyter, doing some research on that. When after a high number of years, the title might be used. And I think for a lot of our things for three press, about three big publishers, that you see about within 2-3 years, the bulk of a publication of a publisher will be used, all titles, up to 98%. So, of course, the usage will vary depending on the institution. And as Arielle mentioned, of course, we are diverse. We have everything like UBC, except we don't have a vid school. We have all the rest. So it's impossible to say for research and teaching what and when what's going to be used. And one way for us to deal with that, and of course, evidence-based can do that partially, but economically speaking, and cost-wise, and quantity-wise, all that, our approach has been buying complete packages. As Michael knows, we've been doing with the Gruyter, and we're doing it with many other publishers. And of course, University Press are very important for us, for our community, and for the quality, of course. First of all, and this is the most important thing, and this is why we're going this route. It's not only a question of money. I would say yes, budget-wise, it's important, of course, but it's a decision how within your institution you want to go, and how the selection is done. And if you want to still go and pick and choose, or if you want to let the liaison librarian or the reference librarian, what do you call them, subject librarians, to decide what to be done also as well. So you have to put that into all the equation and to see what can we do best for our institution, how can we stretch our dollar as much as possible. And I think I'm going to stop here because I think I don't want to monopolize the floor, but we can talk along about that. And we have our differences with Arielle regarding evidence-based, but the way they're doing it partly also as well is quite interesting with backlists also as well. And but one may oppose a backlist usually are cheaper to buy, unit cost-wise. You buy a bulk also as well. And anyway, so for us, this is our way to go. And with the Gruyter, for instance, as you said, Michael, I think we have everything now. For everything from the backlist, everything for front list. And for us, it's important because they're all important presses. And we did the same thing recently with the British, between new British presses. And this is why we're doing it.
I'll just point out that you have supported Vanessa de Burger there at Amsterdam University Press, and Vivian at Berghahn, and Nicola and Charlotte at Edinburgh, and Joe Grieg and Simon at Bristol. You've been generous. I will say that also you're a very creative thinker, so that when I work with you or many universities in Canada, Brock University, Arielle at UBC, McMaster, Western, as soon as they're willing to engage in a conversation, you can make these models work pretty well. And I appreciate that about Canada. It's always fun and interesting. And in the end, you're achieving everybody's mission, which is really what we're after. But Rob is one of those too. Let's give the floor to Rob Thiessen to get his perspective from the University of Calgary.
Well, I don't know if I'll say too much, but I'll just say that we've been evidence-based for a while, and with the pandemic, we went into it more heavily. But it's interesting, of course, in de Gruyter, we just buy front list material from the university presses we want, and sometimes backlist as well for things we're trying to pick up. So in de Gruyter, we've tended to find buying everything to be the best approach for us. And I don't think that's going to change. for other larger presses, we've just found EBA to be a great way to get access to everything and then pick what people are using. And yes, Louis is absolutely right. You can't predict what people are going to use. And just because something is very big and popular one year, it doesn't mean that something completely different won't show up a year or 2 or 3 years later. So there is a certain degree of risk in EBA, but we've gotten more comfortable with it, especially as the pandemic has gone on. And I think we'll be sticking with that model, at least for a bit, for a lot of the larger presses we're dealing with.
All right. Thank you, Rob. I notice also that we have a bunch of presses here. I hate to start naming them because then you always leave somebody out and risk offending somebody. But I saw Michael Duckworth here from Hong Kong University Press. Michael, are you still with us? Perhaps not. It's always interesting.
Hi, thank you, Mike. Yes, I'm here in Hong Kong. It's like 3 a.m. No, it's 2 a.m. No, it's 1 a.m. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. And I miss you already from London a week ago, but thank you for the call out. I appreciate it. It's good to be here.
Michael, do you want to offer a comment maybe about your publishing challenges in Hong Kong for
Yes.
libraries?
Yes. So Hong Kong is a very different library community, and we are dependent somewhat on, let's say, 30% on North American and UK libraries. But then in Asia, the library situation is very different. And we sell ebooks. Ebooks have grown from 10% to 25% of our overall net revenues. And a lot of that is going to the North American libraries who used to buy printed hardcover monographs. So we're trying to catch up to the North American library commercial enterprise, which is driving still some of our acquisitions and publishing strategy. But the market has fallen apart because of COVID and other kind of factors. Meanwhile, our local market is we're like 90% Chinese speaking and 10% English speaking, but we're publishing 80% of our books in English and 20% in Chinese. So we're looking for more and more bilingual connectivity, and the De Gruyter collection program is extremely attractive to us, in part because Asia is not really part of it yet fully in terms of library acquisitions, but our authors, we want to be connected. Of course, we want to have citations, we want to have downloads, but until we get started with open access, and we're just getting started with that, until we really get our full collection into many libraries, we're not going to have that same connectivity that you all enjoy for decades already in North America and Europe. So we're just getting started. We're, give us time, but we're catching up slowly. We've got a lot of interesting content that you might not see in North America and Europe, but thank you very much for the opportunity to comment. And all of you, every comment you've made so far is really important for us here. We're learning, we're growing. Stay with us.
Michael, thank you for getting up in the middle of the night to join us. I'm not sure I would have had the ability to do that. Before we move too far on, and I'm conscious that we're down to nearly just 5 minutes, I would like to see if David Larson would like to make a comment from the University of Manitoba Press.
Thank you, Michael. I think Brian's spoken to the ACUP membership, and has already spoken of us in our list with regard to Indigenous studies. And he mentioned as well that we do publish in regional studies as well. But a lot of our work now is being focused on questions around food security and food studies as well, and environmental studies, which are important areas for us. I'm welcoming this conversation, hearing others and others' experience with De Gruyter, because of course, this is a new relationship for us. We've had others distribute our books before, but entering into a relationship with Librarian now through ACUP, which I think this has a lot of potential and promise.
The interesting thing, David, Brian, Kate, about the ACUP thing is it was a Canadian collection. That is, Canadian libraries could buy this collection of all the Canadian University Press output. And what's happened to it now is we think that collection will be valuable to libraries in Australia, New Zealand, the UK, as well as the US. But there hasn't been an opportunity to acquire it in this comprehensive collection format. So we hope it helps you. I guess we'll find out. It's a grand experiment. But we've just got a few minutes left, and there were a few themes I thought worth pursuing. Many of you, for example, in ACUP, but also Vivian Berghahn, we have Central European University Press here, or we did, are smaller presses. And so Vivian talked about higher prices, fewer books, the challenges of being independent, not having a subvention or external support. Vivian, I don't know if you want to talk about that at all, in particular when you commission a book. What's your thinking about that book? What does it need in order for it to work, for you to be able to take it on, and then to make it an excellent book, which is a requirement for you to survive?
Well, I think there are elements of that, I think Nicola touched upon the challenges of peer review. I think there are sort of those sorts of areas that have become ever more increasingly challenging to find. Our manuscripts generally have 3 peer reviewers. Sometimes we settle on 2. But even just finding one can be a challenge. So how do we really do that? We also have proposals peer reviewed. So there's a very intensive vetting process that happens. And that also adds to the complication and the time span, but also publishing has become more challenging. We haven't even now we have AI to contend with, but when you're thinking about permissions or use and reuse, how open access features with original manuscripts or republications, I think the landscape has become a lot more complicated around also just general licensing. So the process requires a whole skill set. And that's even before you then start to talk about different models. So how do you start to judge how best to distribute a title, thinking outside of the more traditional print, but to different models? So different collections, when does it belong on a De Gruyter collection, for instance, with exclusive access for the unlimited model, which is something we're working with you on and experimenting with, versus single user versus multi-user. So sort of these are elements of how we think about the book that are becoming ever more complicated, but also great opportunities. I think EBA is a good example of a great way of discoverability for backlist titles. I think it's not a frontlist solution, but I would say for lists that are still quite new or developing, I find it fascinating to see which books get picked up in EBA. I think there's some great insights there, also for chapter downloads, which chapters are getting downloaded. So I think there are a lot of ever more complications throughout, but also at the same time, I think a lot more opportunity that allows us to take more risks and allows us to continue with those more marginal titles, while also bigger books can also go further. So I think there are a lot of positives there as well.
Thank you, Vivian. I guess we're in a tough spot now. We need to assign the last word to somebody. Nicola, do you want to close up? I have one quick question. You said you're the 3rd largest university press in the UK. If we discount Cambridge and Oxford, which really aren't university presses, despite what they try to tell us, we know they're big commercial places. You're the biggest, aren't you?
I guess we are. Yeah. I think Bristol University Press is snapping at our heels. So we have a very friendly rivalry. But I think, yes, if we discounted the 2 giants, then right now I think we probably are in revenue terms. Yeah.
All right. Well, listen, I'm sorry, but we're down to no time left. Thank you all for joining us today. This was every one of these is unique. You never know how they're going to go. but this one was interesting as all the others with different points being highlighted. Thank you for joining us. And please join us for the next one. Maybe in about a month, we'll be ready to offer something up with our librarians and presses. Thank you.